To conclude Chapter 21 on the Great War, World War I, we will talk in Part 6 about the effects of the war at home and abroad. And the year 1919 began with joyous victory parades, but the celebrations soon gave way to widespread labor unrest, socialist and communist radicalism, race riots, terrorist bombings, and government crackdowns. And that's basically what's going on in the U.S. Also, the Spanish flu, as mentioned in a previous video, will cause more casualties than the war itself. It became known as the Spanish flu, although its geographic origins are debated, and it spread around the globe and it altered the course of world history. The disease appeared suddenly in the spring of 1918, and its initial outbreak lasted a year, and it killed millions of people worldwide, twice as many as had died in the war. In the United States alone, it accounted for 675,000 deaths, over 10 times the number of U.S. combat deaths in France. A fifth of the nation's population caught the flu, so many that the health system was strained to the breaking point. Hospitals ran out of beds. Funeral homes ran out of coffins. And by the spring of 1919, the pandemic had finally run its course, ending as suddenly and as inexplicably as it had begun. Although another outbreak occurred in the winter of 1920, people had grown more resistant to it, and no disease in human history had killed so many people worldwide, and no war, famine, or natural catastrophe had killed so many people in such a short period of time. Also, the Congress finally passes women's suffrage. And in 1920, it's going to be ratified by the requisite number of states, and now women can vote. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote in national elections. A long time coming. Again, as we mentioned previously, Wyoming had this in 1869. Now it's nationwide. What's happening with the economy? Strikes. Wage and price controls had ended and prices went through the roof. So many workers went on strike, and they want nothing more than higher wages and shorter work weeks. But critics are linking the striking workers with the worldwide communist movement that's now on the scene as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution. And people go, this is America, not Russia. Such charges of a communist conspiracy, though, were greatly exaggerated. In 1919, there's fewer than 70,000 Americans who belonged to the Communist Party. But the most controversial post-war labor dispute was in Boston, where most of the police went on strike on September 9th, 1919. And the furious Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge mobilized the National Guard. After 4 days, the striking policemen offered to return, but instead they were all fired. And Ronald Reagan will do this as well in the early 1980s with the air traffic controllers. When labor leaders appealed for their reinstatement, Coolidge responded in words that made him an instant national hero. Quote, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime," unquote. And now Coolidge is a national figure. Race riots. What African-American leader James Weldon Johnson, one of the Harlem Renaissance writers, called the Red Summer, you can't quite see that, red signifying blood, began in July when a mob of whites invaded a black neighborhood in Longview, Texas, angry over rumors of interracial dating. They burned shops and houses and ran several African Americans out of town. A week later, in Washington, D.C., exaggerated or even false reports of black assaults on white women stirred up white mobs, and gangs of white and black rioters waged a race war in the streets until soldiers and driving rains ended the fighting. The worst was yet to come in Chicago. 38 people were killed and 537 injured in 5 days of race rioting in Chicago, where some 50,000 African Americans, mostly from the rural South, had moved during the war. And it started on a beach, if I recall correctly. And African Americans going on to what was supposedly a white beach or something like that. And leading to tensions, all of this migration, as we talked about, with local whites over jobs and housing. And white unionized workers especially resented blacks who were hired as strike breakers. Altogether, there were 25 race riots in 1919 and 80 lynchings of African Americans. 11 of them were war veterans. The Red Scare. The second Red Scare, actually, well, this is the first one. The second one will be in the 1950s. And it's anti-communist hysteria, again, related to the Bolshevik Revolution. And it includes the arrest without warrants of thousands of suspected radicals, most of whom, especially Russian immigrants, were deported. Fears of revolution in America were fueled by violent actions of a few scattered militants. In early 1919, the Secret Service discovered a plot by Spanish anarchists, mania, the A at the end, anarchists, another cause of the First World War. Maine is a better term. And they wanted to kill Wilson and other government officials. In April of 1919, postal workers intercepted nearly 40 homemade mail bombs addressed to government officials, and one slipped through and blew off the hands of a Georgia senator's maids. Wow. In June, another bomb destroyed the front of U.S. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer's house in Washington, D.C., and Mr. Palmer is not too happy. Palmer had ambitions to succeed Wilson as president, and he concluded that a red menace, a communist blaze of revolution, was sweeping over every American institution of law and order. And in August of 1919, Palmer appointed a 24-year-old attorney named J. Edgar Hoover to lead a new government division created to collect information on radicals. Hoover and others in the Justice Department worked with a network of 250,000 informants in 600 cities, all of them members of the American Protective League, which was founded during the war to root out traitors and labor radicals. Again, war does inalterable things. Once you get these bureaucracies in place, they're going to make things for themselves to do. And there's J. Edgar. He will remain the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation until he dies in 1972. He has the dope on everybody, and politicians run scared away from Mr. Hoover for decades. On November 7, 1919, with Wilson incapacitated in the White House, federal agents rounded up 450 alien radicals, most of whom were law-abiding Russian immigrants looking for work. All were deported to Russia without a court hearing. On January 2, 1920, police raids in dozens of cities swept up 5,000 more suspects like Emma Goldman, famous New York radical, and many were taken from their homes without arrest warrants. By September of 1920, though, when a bomb at the corner of Broad and Wall Streets in New York City killed 38 people, Americans were ready to take it for what it was, the work of a crazed mind, and not the start of some revolution. The Red Scare, nonetheless, left a lasting mark on American life. It strengthened the conservative crusade for 100% Americanism and new restrictions on immigration, as we'll see will happen in the 1920s. The door closes on unlimited immigration to the United States in the 1920s. Churchill, the future British Prime Minister, called post-war Europe a crippled, broken world. Peace did not bring stability. The trauma of war lingered long after the shooting stopped. Most Germans and Austrians believed they were the victims of a harsh peace, and many wanted revenge, especially a hate-filled German war veteran named Adolf Hitler. At the same time, the war hastened the already simmering Bolshevik Revolution. As we've seen, it caused Russia to exit the war and abandon its Western European allies. And in 1922, as we mentioned, the USSR emerges on the world stage, and Soviet communism will be one of the most powerful forces shaping the 20th century. The United States is now the world's dominant power. In 1928, 10 years after the end of the Great War, a British official in London explained that Great Britain now faced a phenomenon for which there is no parallel in our modern history. The United States, he added, was 25 times as wealthy, 3 times as populous, twice as ambitious, almost invulnerable, and at least our equal in prosperity, vital energy, technical equipment, and industrial strength. What came to be called the American century was at hand. And so ends chapter 21. We will now pick up with the clash of cultures, the fascinating decade of the 1920s.